We have a very special show today. Returning to the show, the master classical improviser, Professor David Dolan from the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. I invite the audience to listen to our very enlightening older interview. That would be episode 73. It's a great show. Also joining the program is Professor Henrik Jensen from the Department of Mathematics at the Imperial College of London. He leads the Center for Complexity Science, which engages in a range of research into the applied and fundamental aspects of complexity science. For today's show, we'll be diving into the fascinating collaborative research that my two guests have been doing for the last 10 years involving studying the brain with improvised and non-improvised music and how it functions during each activity, quantifying improvisatory behavior and improvisation and communication between brains. Gentlemen, it's really my honor to introduce you to the show to talk about this important research.
Thank you.
Now, let's actually go right to the beginning. How did you come up with this idea? It's a really brilliant thing to research. Where did it start from?
Well, so the way I got involved was that I had a student 10 years back who was a sitar player herself and curious of doing a PhD involving music and neuroscience. And she found David Dolan on the web and introduced me to David. And that's where we started. The point was that we were doing research on complex systems in all its broadness. So complex systems, I should say, is essentially anything that has a lot of components interacting. And of course, music is exactly like that in many different ways. The brain is complex itself, obviously, with all the zillions of neurons collaborating to make up the mind. And of course, music is often performed as a collaborative effort between musicians. And not least an effort that also often involves the audience. So therefore, for me, it seemed like a fantastic opportunity to see if we could do complexity science on this kind of topic.
And you'll have to explain a lot of things to me and my audience. So, for instance, let's begin with what you termed the levels of synchronization. Now, can you just quickly explain, what do you mean by delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma? When people think of gamma, they think of the Incredible Hulk. So what is that?
Okay, so that's from neuroscience, and I don't know too much about it. I think it's, to a great extent, historically. People started 100 years ago, they noticed that there's electromagnetic fields outside on the exterior of our head, and that obviously they thought immediately that's related to brain activity. And then during these more than 100 years, people have tried to understand how the signal that you can measure on top of your head relates to how the mind process. And what they found was that it was convenient for the analysis to break the signal up into different frequencies. And the easiest way of explaining that is like thinking of light. So light is, of course, white often when it comes from the sun. But we all know, I think, that light actually contains all the different colors at different frequencies. So white light is a mixture of all the different colors. But if you extract a single color, that means that you extract a single frequency from all these frequencies. And that's similar to what people did when they analyzed brain signals. They took the signal and found that it was convenient for many purposes to break it up into different frequencies. We'd actually found that this was not necessarily the best way of analyzing the signal from the musicians. And you don't need to. The equipment, the EEG recorders, gives you the entire time signal. And then you can analyze it the way that, for your purpose, is most convenient.
Right. So this is from the EEG data, basically. You're
Yes.
able to split it up into these different categories just from using the EEG.
Yes. That's tradition in neuroscience, I should say. But let me also immediately hurry and say that when we first started out, one of the things we were excited about as complexity scientists was to see if we could measure by use of mathematics, or say mathematical analysis of the measurements, could we find out how the different parts of the brain communicate, or even how the musicians communicate during the play. So simply look
with each other.
With each other, yes. So how the musicians would communicate amongst themselves as they played the music. And in order to do that analysis, we found that we should not break the signal up into the alpha, beta, gamma, and so on. So for us, I would say it turned out not to be too relevant. Let me maybe explain what we did in terms of causality, because that was quite fascinating. So the point is that, well, the most remarkable, I think, was we were just trying to see if we could actually, from the measurements of the brains, understand how musicians communicate without asking them, or even maybe without them being totally conscious about this. And what we found was that typically that experiment we started out with, we had three musicians, and a harp and a viola and a flute. And when we looked at these people playing, it looked like the viola player was really calling the shot, sitting in the middle of a very flamboyant person. But then the analysis of the time signals actually showed that it was typically the harp that was leading and sending information to the others, if you like, or whatever, were communicating to the others.
Although she looks the most shy and inward going, and you wouldn't think that she was actually running the show, but she did.
So this is interesting. Let me jump in here, gentlemen. So you basically got three musicians and you got a couple of listeners. I noticed in the video, it's a fascinating video, and I want people to watch the presentation and see the video. You have these three musicians, and are they from the Guildhall, David? Are they Guildhall musicians?
Yes, they were all students of mine in the past, in their previous lives, moving on to be very successful professionals, but they all went through an intensive training of classical improvisation and how to apply it in their performance of repertoire. So they are fully contaminated with improvisation.
So a quick question, is there any particular reason for that instrumentation that you chose?
No. These were among the many possible people, those who were free during those dates, and that's why they were...
Did you need at least one harmonic instrument like a harpist to make it more structured in that sense?
That's a good question. Not necessarily. If you take a string quartet, you get the harmonic, structure through the voice-leading conjunction of the four parts. Again, we had these three musicians on, and yes, I guess that being a trio, I would have certainly preferred. I'm thinking out loud now. One harmonic instrument, but a string trio could do the job just as well. Probably, just a wild guess, the cellist then would be having a long-term structural influence by playing the bass line, which in turns run the show as far as the harmonic support is concerned. But you're right when you hint towards the harp being the harmonic provider of the texture, having this longer-term structural influence.
Now, you mentioned let me ask about the selection of the music. Now, there's some Telemann, there was some Ravel, Ibert, and also some improvisation. How did you come to choose that music? Was it the musicians themselves?
Yes, I asked them to choose two repertoire works which are different from one another, and that's what they came up with. It was very much following the musicians' appetite and motivation, plus improvisations that they did, again, twice. Every piece was performed twice, once in a more strict, they were asked to play as if they are in an international competition with a rather conservative jury, playing without any surprises to the jury, but the best they can make and the most expressive and most successful. And the other one was with improvised approach, improvisational concept, which includes when a theme repeats, as you know, extemporized elaborations, and that involved, and Henrik can tell you about how it was manifested in the analysis, some telepathic moments of surprising each other and giving way spontaneously to something that another partner did in a completely unprepared way. And I know that because I followed the rehearsal. So nothing that was done in the concert was rehearsed, so to speak. And there were also improvisations played twice, once in a more controlled way, more cautious way. I don't know if cautious is the right word, but less flamboyant, less risk-taking in approach. And the other one was a kind of stronger let go, as if they play for musician friends 2:00 in the morning after a good party. That's really what it was.
I guess the $1,000,000 question, and this can be just a short one, and then we'll get into the details of it, but the $1,000,000 question is the brain function radically different when you improvise and when you don't improvise?
Yes, so that's for sure. So although there are many reasons we need to be cautious for concerning the exact details, what is clear after many different experiments with different musicians, that there is a significant difference. The most easy to explain, I think, is in a more recent experiment. We looked at, again, a trio. This was a singer, a pianist, and a flautist. And we had 4 listeners also wired up to EEG recorders. And then we looked at what is called the complexity level of the signal. So you take the time series as they come out from the electrodes sitting on the heads of the musicians and listeners. And then you look at how much variation there is in this signal. And there is a piece of mathematics developed by 2 Israeli mathematicians, Lempel and Ziv, back in the 70s, that is used to characterize how much structure there is in the signal. It's the one that we all use when we check how much we can compress a file on our computer. The point is that if you have a file that contains 1,000 ones, then it's very easy to compress it. You don't need to write 1,000 times. You can just say 1,001. But if you have 1,000 different numbers, then of course you need to write them all down. So that's the kind of variation in the signal that this simple Ziv is characterizing. What we then found was that the degree of complexity measured by this Lempel-Ziv index is higher when the musicians improvise than when they don't improvise, or rather when they play in the let go, the more free style, than the strict style. And that's the same for the listeners.
So what is that index? Can you just explain what that index means?
Yeah. That's what I wanted to highlight by mentioning that this was not something we started to use. Neuroscientists have apparently used this for a long time to try to get an index of how aware you are. So what is known is that this index is lower when you sleep than when you are awake. And then again, if you are on psychedelic drugs like LSD, then the index is even higher. So it's taken as a measure of how aware your brain is, meaning that during the let-go mode, both players, musicians, and listeners have a state of mind that is significantly more aware or complex than when they either perform or listen to the strict mode.
Let's talk about strict and let go. That really means non-improvisation and improvisation. Is that correct?
Yes, except that one shouldn't confuse it with less good performance or less expressive or less motivated. The strict version was one where the musician took no risks. They did not apply an improvisational approach to text in the sense that when a theme repeats or when you play a reprise, there's a double bar and you go back to the beginning and play a reprise, as we know at the time, and that's the tradition that is now we are reviving, you would never copy-paste. You would never play twice the same thing, but you would re-embellish and recreate this theme. So in the strict version, they have not done that, but they did their best when it comes to the expressive narrative. The Let Go was one where they have applied the improvisational approach, what our recent study establishes as improvisational state of mind, and provides a proof to the existence of such state, manifested by elaborated repeats with different notes, but also by more risky approach to phrasing, rubato, and how musicians related to each other lines. And the fascinating point, the $1 million element discovery for us from the music side was that in the improvisatory, in the Let Go version, they played in a less accurate way when it comes to the metronomical evenness of the short-term values. So the quavers and the crotchets were less even, but when it came to being together in cadential points and the long-term coherence of phrases, it was much more coherent and much more together, although there was much more risk-taking involved. So if you think of it following common sense, it would seem much harder to be together in the let go state. But in fact, they were much more together, and that is also what the musicians themselves reported, because a part of the research was taking self-reflective accounts from the performers after they have played, and they all reported being in a much more effortless state of mind and performance that involved pleasure to a higher level, although much more dangerous one. They indeed took many more risks.
Let me ask about strict. Now, was that music sight-read, or was it memorized and performed?
Good question. No, it was not sight-read. It was part of the repertoire that they knew very well. So it was a concert where they performed well-known to them repertoire. But when it came to the Let Go version, they have surprised themselves, and you could see them on their face. They threw on each other's hot potatoes, which were not there during rehearsals. But they didn't touch the structural elements. The harmonic progressions were always the same because it was internalized in a very deep way. So although it was well rehearsed, there was the element of freshness and creating here and now. And that leads us to the main element behind it, which is that the performance created in the true meaning of the word and not executed notes.
Right. Now, let's talk about memory and working memory and use of memory. Obviously, both acts, strict and let go, utilize memory, but perhaps in different ways. Could you perhaps explain how memory is different between the two phases?
Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot. But it's true what you say, that we should actually, in principle, one should be able to see that from the EEG. But there are a number of reasons that we might not be able to. So we never looked at it. That's one reason. That's certainly for sure. But also that we didn't have very many electrodes on the heads, simply because we had to do with whatever equipment we had available. So we were not able to look at in the same detail as people often do when they study music experiments and relate to memory.
With regard to attention, it gets the sense, like I'm reading from your presentation, it said there's a sustained alpha increase in Brodmann area 9 during letting go, involved in sustained attention. But does that mean that there's less sustained attention in strict? I mean, could you explain that to me?
Well, it means that there is, for that specific measurement, or for that specific performance, that was the case. It's difficult to know how representative this kind of finding is, and we should. I've been told by many neuroscientists that we should be very careful paying too much attention to this allocation of tasks to Brodmann areas and so on. So this is maybe something that is less trustworthy than, for instance, when I mentioned the l'impulsif, which is is much less dependent on understanding the structure of the brain, because we just look at the overall complexity and time.
Nikhil, let me come back to your question about memory from the musical performance side of things. We have asked the musicians about that, and what they reported was that in the strict, and I'm thinking out loud, maybe the word strict is not ideal, in the kind of straightforward, more controlled performance, they were functioning more locally in terms of the details of the coming notes, not going from note to note, but more locally, shorter term. When they performed through the improvised state of mind or the let go, what they saw in their ears, and I'm of course using it metaphorically, what they heard in their inner ear while performing was of a longer distance ahead. They were more ahead of the game while playing, and that means, again metaphorically, that they saw in their inner listening a greater distance ahead. So they were less busy with the details of the next few notes and more with gestures, which connects them and the listeners more with expressive elements than when you control, the next two notes ahead of you.
So in that sense, of course, you could imagine that this is what the EEG suggests when it allocates this difference in the Broadband area in terms of self-awareness, right? Because the musicians are less concerned. That's what they told us afterwards, right? That they are less concerned with the technicality, if you like, and more in a flow state.
And just know the contradiction, it's not, but it seems as if, because they took more risks and they were less concerned about, accidents, they were less anxious, they actually experienced more joy while performing. They performed a more accurate performance in terms of long-term phrasing and the complicated elements of being together, at the same time as being less anxious. So it was a deal of investing less in the nitty-gritty side of things and getting more.
I hate to ask gross, broad questions, but perhaps that might be the simpler way to really get into the research. If we talk about overall brain activity, you've mentioned that it is different between the two acts. Is there an increase? I mean, is the brain being utilized more when you're improvising, or is it being utilized less? Are you more relaxed activity-wise with the electrical signals?
Yeah. So I don't think that we can say anything about that there's less activity, but it's certainly different activity. And it's an activity that seems both from the EEG, this, should we say, I don't know exactly what to call it, a little bit amateurish way of trying to figure out how the EEG relate to function by doing what we did, namely trying to figure out which part of the brain might be active and then use these old-fashioned Broadband areas. But that exercise did suggest that these performers were more in a relaxed state. I don't think that means that the brain is less active. I mean, this is without knowing too much about it, but I would think that's similar to the fact that when you sleep, you can be very active, right? In the REM state of sleep just before you wake up, the brain is extremely active, but it's more relaxed at the same time. So I think it's something like this that is also happening here. At least that goes nicely with what I talked about in terms of the complexity measure, that that there's certainly a lot of activity in the let go mode, but the musicians themselves feel more relaxed. And that also relates to anecdotal evidence from the allocation of activity to Broadband areas, that they're forgetting themselves, so to say.
Yeah, note what Henrik has just said. They are more relaxed, although the activity is intense. And that goes very much along the lines of what we are looking for when it comes to performing musicians' well-being. When the stage anxiety, let's call it, or performance anxiety goes down, that's exactly where we are. There is a more relaxed state of being, while being in a more intense creative act. So the two not only don't contradict, but it's a combination we're looking for.
For instance, if you took somebody who does not improvise and you attached electrodes to read their brain and told them, now you have to improvise, perhaps they might be stressed because doing an activity they've never done before. Or perhaps if you put electrodes on a performer who is very comfortable with improvising, they might appear more relaxed. Do you think these are all things that might affect the overall brain scan?
Yes, I guess so, and you're right, of course. If you ask a professional musician who is used to be comfortable on stage playing, without improvising, to suddenly improvising, especially if you put audience and journalists there, he is very likely to look very different from our improvising musicians in the experiment that Henrik is describing. But that comes down to the fact that especially in our era when improvisation is not something you grow up with from musical childhood, is. So yes, this is a discipline that one learns. It involves a lot of unlearning, a lot of connecting with one's musical instincts and connecting the instincts with professional know-how. And yes, I agree that what your question suggests very elegantly is that this is something that one has to make oneself familiar with. But once you are, you get the results that Henrik described.
Now, with regard to the pieces that were improvised, as you know, as you're a master improviser, you could really do many different kinds of things. So you could be a very fast kind of improvisation. You could do a very gentle, slow andante type of improvisation. Would that be interesting to analyze if you're playing a very fast, rapid-fire call and response with somebody versus a very relaxed, gentle improvisation conversation?
Well, it might be interesting to hear Henrik thinking out loud about what it may do to one's brain activity. Musically speaking, a very fast and flamboyant virtuosity performance will, of course, be very exciting, but if it doesn't have any coherence or substance, very quickly a listener will become disengaged. And after the first wow effect of the first 3 or 4 seconds, not more, there will be a kind of disappointment or lower engagement, I think, while a slow but high quality and meaningful exchange between musicians improvising might build up to a greater excitement, and vice versa, of course. A boring, slow improvisation will be perceived as boring by a listener, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think there's something here that's really worth stressing. So our research is very different from the way research on music is typically done, where I think most neuroscientists would like to devise experiments in the spirit of science, that you try to make as many controlled variations as possible and so on. And that's not what we do, because the idea has always been to do something that was as close as possible to a real concert and a real performance. Meaning that, yes, definitely. But that then means that what has been the most important is to make sure that the musicians feel comfortable and they feel that they are actually expressing themselves artistically. So what comes out of this is then a different type of experiments where we cannot answer what would have happened if, and not that these questions are not exciting, they are, but we would need to do new experiments that address that kind of variation. But within, so I see it more like, it's a bit like when you do astronomy, right? You just observe the stars, you can't really do experiments on them. And it's a bit like here, we have some musician stars, and we simply let them perform in a mode that makes themselves comfortable. And then we get other kinds of results, like the one I hurry to talk about, the one where we looked at the degree of similarity between the functioning of the musician's brains and the audience. And what we found was that during the go, there are these special moments, the tinkle moments, where you really feel that the music is moving you. And we looked at those specifically and analyzed how the excitation or the activity in the musician brains, or the brains of the musicians, compared to the activity in the brains of the four listeners that were wired up. And clearly, during these special moments where the musicians really managed to communicate some sort of emotional content, the activity was much more similar of the musicians and the listeners than otherwise outside these moments.
Okay, so you mentioned, and David, you identified these key quote-unquote magic moments in the pieces that are analogous to the moments where the hairs on your body stand up because it's such a special moment. What is happening in the brain when those magic moments happen? And more importantly, what do I have to do to get more of them?
Yeah,
that's a $2 million question.
That's a really tricky question. So what is happening? I don't think we really know, because so what we do know is what I just said, that there's more synchrony, there's more similarity in the way the brain of the musicians and the brain of the listeners are activated during those moments than otherwise outside these moments. But to actually answer the question, what exactly is happening, were difficult. We tried to look at this l'impulsif measure, the complexity measure, and had some idea that maybe this would be typically higher during those moments, but it wasn't. So at the moment, we can't really answer what it is that is happening in terms of communication within the brain or in terms of the brain's complexity.
Did you tell the audience that it was an improvisation, or did you keep it a secret?
No, that's secret.
No, we didn't give any clues to the audience. They just knew that they were going to listen to 4 pairs of performances that might be different from one another in certain ways, and that's it. And because the concert experiment included pieces of repertoire and improvisations, we told them that sometimes you may hear the same piece twice.
And that was specifically designed because you wanted to have that concert experience and you wanted to hear the listeners. And I guess in this conversation, we haven't talked too much about the listener. So maybe, Henrik, why don't you talk about the listener's experience now?
So, of course, we have what we would call the objective analysis from the EEG. But that's beside of what I already said of the higher complexity and so on. It's a difficult thing, and that's notorious in neuroscience. And when I report on our research and there are neuroscientists present, they always are quite reluctant in going from the EEG measurements to interpreting it in terms of brain functionality. But we had John Sloboda, professor of music psychology and I guess head of research at Guildhall. He was also involved, and he simply handed out questionnaires to the musicians asking about
the audience.
Sorry, I meant the audience.
Yeah.
Of course, the audience, yes, and asked about their subjective experience, how they felt the music was. Was it more engaging? Was it more risk-taking? Was it more musical, and so on?
And improvisatory. He actually put one question, well, which one was more improvisatory-like, although the audience didn't know that we are working with improvisational elements.
And statistically, the audience gets it every time. They get that the let go version is more engaging, more interesting to listen to.
That's really interesting. So maybe you might have to repeat that. Did you just say that the let go portion had more interest in the listener?
Absolutely. Without them knowing, They just listen to two performances of the same piece, let's say that a piece of Schubert, and they don't know what the difference is. And then they spontaneously identify the let go as the more exciting one to listen to. And this is, I mean, some of course get it the other way around, but statistically, it's always the case that it's the let go that's
always. That's amazing. Okay.
Yes, in a very overwhelming way. It wasn't just slightly above the average line. It was clearly every time and very significantly.
Since time is short, I'd like to ask, if you had all the money in the world and for funding, how would you redo this experiment and what would you be looking for?
Well, I would say immediately we'll do some of the things that you alluded to before, different types of improvisation. We would like to do at time resolved, so to say, follow the musicians as they go through David's course, for instance. We would like to know more about the difference between experienced listeners and non-experienced listeners. So far, I should say, we haven't identified any overall difference. It means that people that are not very familiar with classical music, they respond to this question about which type of performance is most engaging, the same way as more trained people. But there's lots of details there that could be interesting. Then we would like to have better equipment, simply to measure the EEG much more non-intrusive. The kind of equipment we have used, I think at least sometimes were pretty unpleasant for the musicians, and obviously that's a distraction for them while they're trying to do something that is somewhat demanding.
Can I ask you a quick question? If you had told the audience that there was going to be improvisation, would that have affected their answers?
Yes, I think immediately, actually. Because then they would be trying to listen to this, and there is also this worry that, then they would know that there is a correct answer. And that's, of course, unpleasant. You might get it wrong, right? And I think that would really be disturbing. Can I say something that is really, I forgot to say, that our big wish would be to get enough funding so that we could try to understand a little bit better in detail what it is the brain does when it improvises. And that's because we have this feeling that it actually might be helpful for sort of general understanding of mental health. Here in Europe, I think also in the US, there's a lot of mental health problems at the moment, and especially at universities amongst young people being trained in whatever, not only musicians. And you could have this feeling that this might have something to do with you not being able to improvise. I mean, the ultimate is as autistic people, right, that simply cannot improvise. So you could hope that this kind of situation, which is very unique, where you could do the exact same thing in an improvised and less improvised manner, could help us to understand what is needed of the brain in order to be comfortable with improvisation. And then that could be used as some sort of therapy for people with mental problems.
Would it be inaccurate to say that strict is a left brain thing and let go is a right brain thing, or is that a myth?
Yeah, I think that is mainly a myth. I think there are indications in some of our measurements that this is true. There's always in the musicians more activity in the right hemisphere. So it's a bit difficult to say anything reliable. I don't think we have evidence that this is the case. Music seems to be very much a right hemisphere thing.
You see, even when musicians play in what we call, and again it's a problematic term, strict way, they express an emotional arousal is taking place amongst them, the musicians and their audiences. So it is to do with, less or non-only cerebral, rational series of decisions, which is why I think what Henrik has just mentioned, the music making as a whole lives perhaps more, or parts of it at least, in that side of the brain. But we are talking about a more refined differentiations, but as such very powerful.
To talk about, you mentioned it might be more pleasurable in the let go phase of playing. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So would you say one of the key takeaways is that it's just more fun in some ways to improvise?
Yes, I can say that for sure, because but for sure, again, at this anecdotal level, I was at a conference where I happened to meet one of David's former pupils. She was there because she was a partner of a physicist, and therefore she was just following along, and we were talking about what sort of things we did, and I was explaining this project, and then she suddenly said, yeah, but this is all right. This is precisely correct. This lowers the anxiety. And it turned out that she's a Polish violinist, and she has followed David's course, not because she really wanted to become an improvising musician, but because of the ability that the course helps her to be more relaxed and less scared if something should go wrong.
And I can tell you that in vast majority amongst my students now, I'm afraid we're talking about 30 years, you can see a process where, to begin with, the level of anxiety goes up because, as you, Nikhil, has just said before, people who are already serious professional musicians who were brought up following the idea that you play what's on the score only and accurately and make sure no nonsense plays. So when they are, asked or encouraged to take a direction where they have to play unwritten notes and take risks, it involves at first some anxiety, but then it goes to very much the other direction and lowers their general level of anxiety when they perform very significantly.
If more people are interested in this research and related research, can you recommend more links and websites and papers that perhaps they could check out?
That's a difficult one, actually. So we have our own couple of papers, and there is a video, I guess there are 2 videos now produced by Imperial College.
Yeah, and there are a few scholar studies about the revival of improvisation in classical music, but this is still a newborn baby. So first of all, the baby is born, and I think we are allowed to talk. We are allowed to talk about revival of classical improvisation, but your question is a painfully good one because classical improvisation was in coma for over 100 years. It will take us at least one full session to talk about why, but the fact is that after World War I, classical improvisation was almost an oxymoron or a typo. Sounds like an error. It's either classical or improvisation.
But there is, of course, the conference you organized.
Yes.
The world's first conference on classical improvisation. Are there some web material from that?
Yes, thank you. So at the Guildhall, we had last May the first international conference, not only conference, also a festival, we called it, of classical improvisation, with several aspects of demonstrating it. I would also mention the Imprometric website, which is the result of a pan-European project that has been running now for the 7th year and aims to revive classical improvisation in leading European university-level conservatoires. The Royal Conservatoire of The Hague, together with Guildhall School, is among those who are contributing a lot to the revival of classical improvisation, and many. There are, time is too short to mention them all, but we are. I think more and more interest is now there, although it's just a beginning, but I think it's a promising beginning. You asked about books. The Unpremeditated Art of Cadences is one book along those lines. Bruno Nettle work is really gold in that respect. He's an ethnomusicologist, and he looks into why improvisation went downhill in the Western, cultural circles. And some of his findings are not very, easy to read. He's talking about the white elite snobbing the less white music cultures like jazz as a part of the motivation of playing down classical improvisation and all kind of,
Well, those are pretty excellent resources. And since time is running out, Henrik, did we miss out any key takeaways from your research that we really should mention?
Yeah, maybe I would like to say that for me, at least, this was a fantastic surprise that something as intangible as the emotional experience of listening to two performances that actually don't differ much. It's not like in jazz, right, where there's an enormous difference. That is possible to capture by mathematics and brain scanning equipment. I thought this was pretty fantastic. So there is a substantial aspect, sort of very hardcore brain aspect in the improvisation. So it's not just a matter of taste, right? Well, we also know it, of course. This is confirmed by the subjective experience of the listeners. But definitely, it's not just a fashion. It is something that really makes a difference to the brain.
I'm sure, within any research, everyone is a little cautious to make firm conclusions. But what hypotheses do you have? Do you have any hypotheses of what you might find that you can't really say for sure, but you suspect might be a conclusion?
Yeah, I would think that too. The first is that for musicians actually become better musicians. And better in this, not in the sense that they can play faster or anything, but they can express themselves better and they can feel more relaxed while they do it. And then the other aspect, that's even more speculative, of course, is that there might definitely be a link to mental health, as we discussed before, that if one could, in schools, say, emphasize more sort of free play, improvisatory performances, not necessarily only in music, that might have an important effect on mental health. But that's, of course, at the total speculative level.
Allow me to add, first of all, that Henrik's first hypothesis is confirmed by well over 300, I would say, self-reflective accounts of students who have done this course for the last 28 to 29 years, very, very clearly. I don't think there is any exception to that. That's exactly what they said, actually, that it improved their abilities as performers across the board of all elements of performing. Another hypothesis that I think we might discover is that the relations between performance and audience in so-called classical music, in the Western art music making world, might benefit hugely. As we know, there are signs of crisis in concert venues, in many performances. The average age of audience goes up and numbers sometimes go down, not necessarily in the big festivals, but in more average halls in not the most supported venues. And what we saw when it comes to the relation between performance and audience, which is a much greater connection, much stronger experience of audience, might suggest that this is one way of coming back to the time when audience was an active part of the experience, and it was much more about the performer being a creator with capital C rather than executors of notes.
Well, let me just say this, an absolutely fascinating area of research. I do hope you can get the funding to pursue this on a grander scale. A big thank you to my wonderful guests, Professor David Dolan, Professor Henrik Jensen, for sharing this important research. Please, let's continue this dialogue for a future date. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.